Today we want to begin the discussion of law and covenant. This is going to take us some distance all the way through Deuteronomy, which has at its core the idea of covenant and is itself sometimes viewed as a covenant document very explicitly. And from there we will go into the narratives, which are theologically at least built on Deuteronomy. And that's going to take us the rest of the term. So this is a kind of watershed in the course as well as in the narrative. Just to remind you, since it seems like years since we last actually talked about the Old Testament, we are in the narrative at the point of crossing the sea and moving into the wilderness. We've already seen that the wilderness narratives, according to tradition, are all marked by the theme of rebellion in one way or another. Israel does not seem to have done particularly well in the wilderness, and the wilderness pattern to the narrative is to move from one location to another and from one crisis to the next. It's a little like some organizations we know, which seem to lurch from one crisis to the next. The government seems to work that way these days, and there are other things that one could do. Yale is said sometimes to work in that same way, that we move from one crisis to the next, and there's never any normal. That seems to be the way that Israel worked in the wilderness. You've already seen, when you looked at Exodus 14, that according to the Yahwist's view of things, the wilderness actually begins after chapter 12 and the actual leaving of the people from Egypt. Once you have the narrative of the death of the firstborn, then immediately Pharaoh finally gets the point and lets people go, and they are now in the wilderness according to the Yahwist. So the Yahwist tells the first wilderness story in conjunction with the crossing of the sea. The first time the people rebel is when they are at the edge of the sea, and they look back and see the Egyptians coming after them, and they immediately rebel against Moses. And their complaint is precisely in the pattern of the wilderness complaints. They all have a similar pattern and they all have a similar theme. And it doesn't seem to matter whether we're dealing with the Yahwist narrative or a priestly narrative. They basically are all the same. The differences in the patterns of the wilderness stories do not hinge on the literary source. All of the literary sources agree that this was really a bad time for Israel. To be sure, there will be some prophetic retrospectives which seem to look at the wilderness as a positive period of time. The book of Hosea, for instance, seems to see the wilderness as a pattern, is a time of testing of Israel, of refining Israel, so that it would only get better by meeting these trials in the wilderness. But that is a kind of nostalgic look back. And very few of the other literary documents that have been preserved see the wilderness as anything but a really bad time. And in fact, when it is described at all, it is described in terms which actually evoke the notion of the underworld. The wilderness and the underworld all have things in common. They are without water. Food is irrelevant. And so analogizing it with the wilderness seems like the right thing to do. The general pattern of the wilderness stories, as I've already said, is fairly easy to see and to line out for you. And here, your form critical research will help you. And the pattern of the wilderness stories is very obvious. The stories all begin by people journeying to a new location. This reminds you a bit of the Abraham stories, where the narratives are tied together by these itinerary notices. They move from X to Y, and at Y a new Abraham story is told, and then they move from Y to Z and we get another story, and so on. So literarily, that's the way the wilderness stories work. The people move into a new location, and in the second part of the pattern is that they encounter some sort of problem. Problems vary. They have a lack of water, they have a lack of food, they have fights over leadership, there is military opposition, there are strange things going on in the priesthood, one thing after another. There never seems to be a kind of normal. They respond to this, and this is the third part of the pattern, by murmuring or complaining. There is a technical verb that is used, the verb loon in Hebrew. It's loon 2, not loon 1, which means something else. And it's usually translated just to murmur, which is a good neutral translation. Whether it is a rebellion or not, we do not know, but it is at least the expression of discontent. That's what the verb means. And that's what the people do. And anytime you see that verb used, you know that we've got another wilderness story underway, because it is not used anywhere else in that meaning. So the people murmur or complain or rebel. Sometimes it is said that they actually rebel, and that seems to be an extreme reaction on the part of the people. In the most of the stories, Moses then passes the complaint on to Yahweh. Moses doesn't want to have to deal with this, and sort of sides with the people, representing them to the deity. And as if to say to the deity, all right, look, what are we going to do about this one? Last time you dealt with it and it was all right. This time it doesn't look so good. What do you propose to do about this? So it's God's problem, and Moses usually passes it on, quite obviously, to the deity. And the last part of the story then describes the response of the deity, who either responds favorably by fixing things or unfavorably by punishing the people for murmuring. And the trick of studying the wilderness stories is to determine what it is that triggers a particular response from the deity. It seems to be all right, for example, to murmur about the basic necessities of life. You can murmur because there is no water. You can murmur because there is no food. You can murmur because there is military opposition. But if you go to complaining about the kind of food that God provides, if you don't like the manna that God gives them in the wilderness, if you don't like the quail that go along with the manna, then you're in trouble. God does not like people sort of redoing the divine salvation that God has provided for them. And so when they go to reminiscing about the good old days in Egypt, which is often what they do, the notion that freedom in the wilderness is worse than slavery in Egypt, where they at least had really good things to eat, and they proceed to list all the wonderful things that they had to eat. It doesn't sound like a good time to me. I think the quail and the manna would have been better, and so does the narrator. But that's what they do. And so God does not respond favorably to those kinds of complaints. A typical example from the Yahwist is chapter 15, beginning around verse 22. They have now crossed the sea successfully, so the first murmuring has taken place and been responded to positively. God has opened a path in the sea, however you understand that, has opened a path in the sea for the Israelites to cross over safely, and now they are on the other side. And so the irony is, once they go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, which after all is what they told the Pharaoh was the goal of this expedition, Moses said, let my people go so that they may serve me. And to get to Sinai, they have to go a 3 days journey into the wilderness. So what happens when they get there? They went into the wilderness of Shur. This is verse 22. They went 3 days into the wilderness, and what do you know? There is no water. And then they came to Marah, and there is water at Marah, but they can't drink the water of Marah because it is bitter. That's why they called it Marah, which in Hebrew means bitter. Okay, so you got all of that clear. And the people then complained against Moses and said, "What shall we drink?" Well, that's a reasonable complaint, apparently. And he cried out to Yahweh. And the Lord showed him, this is a translation here, is very, very strange. It seems to say, it doesn't say he showed him a piece of wood. The Hebrew seems to say he taught him about a piece of wood. And I don't know exactly, and neither does anybody else, exactly what that means. Whether there are peculiar properties to this piece of wood, or whether he didn't see the piece of wood, or just exactly what it was that Yahweh taught him. So that is an exegetical issue, and if you look at translations, you will see differences in the translation. And so remembering your clues to how you do exegesis, when you see these kinds of different translations, you would immediately say, aha, there is a problem in the underlying text. And sure enough, there is a footnote in NRSV on that phrase that suggests we don't really know exactly how to translate this, but it seems to mean this. And so he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. So it suddenly becomes drinkable by virtue of whatever it is that Moses did. Now, there will be other water stories in this collection. That seems to be a perennial problem in the wilderness. And all of these will work the same way, except for the last one, where Moses, of course, strikes the rock in order to bring water in the middle of the wilderness. And Yahweh is really unhappy with that and tells Moses, for that you cannot go into the land. And nobody has figured out exactly what the problem was there. And I invite you to worry about that later on if you really want to worry about it. It's one of the unsolved mysteries of the Moses stories, and just why it is that Yahweh does not allow Moses finally to cross the Jordan with the people. In any case, those are the Moses stories. This is immediately followed in chapter 18 by a story that seems loosely to have to do with how the people governed themselves in the wilderness. And in the story, which begins in chapter 18, verse 13, Moses has taken on the responsibility of judging disputes among the people. Needless to say, there are a lot of people by this time, and so Moses is very, very busy all day judging disputes among the people. And so he's sitting there on his rock waiting for people to come, and he's there all day from morning till night. And his father-in-law, Jethro, who is identified as a priest of Yahweh, comes up to him and offers him some advice. And he says, you know, you're going to kill yourself if you keep doing things like this. What you need to do is get some help, and suggests appointing representatives from each of the tribes to take on the day-to-day activities of governing the people. And then if there are really serious problems, Moses can handle the more difficult cases. It's in this context of having to get some kind of order to the people, to life in the wilderness, that becomes the background for the visit to Sinai. And when they finally reach Sinai, it is clear that God has in mind doing more than simply judging individual disputes, but instead giving them a set of specific laws which will govern behavior. And this introduces what is in fact a very long legal section of the Pentateuch. It's the bulk of the Pentateuch in terms of just sheer length, and it stretches from Exodus 20 all the way to Numbers 10, when the people finally get out of Sinai and eventually begin to go through the wilderness in the general direction of the land which God promised them. That brings you to Numbers 13, and you all know by this time what happens in Numbers 13 and 14. There is a spying expedition. The people bring back a false report. Yahweh is really upset with that rebellion, and it says, all right, for that you have to spend time in the wilderness, 40 years to be precise, until this generation that rebelled has died off, and then their descendants will be able to cross over. So there really is not much narrative activity. All of that other material is set at Sinai, and we will come back later on to talk a bit about the effect of that, what it means that all of this kind of law is set at Sinai. So from the necessity of having some kind of order in Israel, in chapter 18, we begin in chapter 19 the preparations for going to Sinai. There is some confusion in this narrative in terms of the linear progression of the narrative. So you should not be confused by that. It's not clear who gets to go up. And here, on the one hand, the people are told to purify themselves as if they were going to go up and listen. Later on, we will be told that only Moses gets to go up and listen. And then we will be told again, after the Ten Commandments have been given, that the people heard them. So apparently they were close enough to the mountain that they could hear what God was saying. And so it is clear in the way the narrative packages the event that the Ten Commandments have a special status in the sense that they were given directly by God to the people and not through the mediation of Moses, whereas the rest of the law was given through the mediation of Moses. And that idea is explicit at the end of the account of the giving of the Ten Commandments, where the people say to Moses, you know, Moses, we've heard enough of this. We've heard these Ten Commandments. We are still here. We have survived listening to the voice of God, but we really don't want to do that again. If you want to go up there and listen to what God has to say, feel free to do that and come back and let us know. And God seems to think that's a really good idea. This idea will be explicit in Deuteronomy. And what has happened here probably is that the Deuteronomic version of the giving of the Ten Commandments has been retrojected back into Exodus, and they're trying to get the two stories more or less to line up. So we have two accounts of the giving of the Decalogue, and they are not exactly the same, but the general idea of the giving of the Decalogue has been harmonized in the two accounts. So don't get too confused trying to figure out who's doing what when. But we finally, at the end of chapter 19, are at the beginning of the Decalogue. So we now can switch from talking about the context narrative to talking about the law itself. Obviously, we can't here spend hours and hours on the contents of all of this. You've got some readings on the general patterns of the different law codes. Scholars usually divide the legal section into different law codes, which may or may not be associated with the traditional literary sources. The neo-Wellhausenists think that the literary sources, J.P., and something called the Holiness Code, which is a part of the priestly code now, but which probably historically was either earlier or later, depending on who you read. So there seems to be some development going on, particularly within the P section of this. So the neo-Wellhausenists think that you can trace the traditional lines, and most of the early material in the legal section will be assigned to E. Now, we haven't heard much from E in our narrative, There are very few things that are assigned to E. The largest section usually, as you know, is the Joseph story, and that, as I suggested, is probably a counsel of despair. They don't know what else to do with it. It doesn't fit Jay's patterns. It doesn't look like the priestly narrative, and so they say, well, it must be the Elohist by the process of deduction. So we haven't heard much from E, but a lot of people think that the earliest of our codes that begin immediately after chapter 20 and the Ten Commandments, the earliest of our codes are probably from E. And I would prefer to think that in terms of tradition, they are probably proto-Deuteronomistic. They sound a good bit like Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy, as we'll see when we get there next week, Deuteronomy has an awful lot of stock in the idea of the Ten Commandments and the trip to Sinai and the Exodus itself. D really sees Israelite history beginning at that point and not much earlier with the ancestors. The Book of Deuteronomy has only a few vague references to the ancestors. They don't play much role in the way that Deuteronomy thinks about things. The only real clear reference is in Deuteronomy 26, which talks about a wandering Aramean being the ancestor of Israel. And the wandering Aramean went down into Egypt and lived there and became a great nation, and then God brought them out of Egypt. So the only reference to the ancestors is a kind of device, a literary device for getting the people down into Egypt and then bringing them back. It's the Exodus itself, which for Deuteronomy is the crucial event. And that is what you will pick up from the way in which the Ten Commandments, both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, the Ten Commandments are introduced. So two things are happening here. One is that we are getting an account of the giving of laws, and very specific laws that have to do with one thing or another. It is certainly the case that this is not all of the laws that Israel knew about. There are certainly others. There are references to others. We'll get narrative references later on to things that they say are law or are illegal. And they don't appear in our legal section. So there must have been other things, and there was probably a customary law. Most societies have a customary law which people follow. It is the what anthropologists sometimes call the mores, the ethical guidelines that are simply passed on from generation to generation and mark what we think of as a civilized society. And most societies have things like this. They are so common and so intimately passed on that they're rarely written down. And so if you have heard a parent say to a child, we don't do things like that, that's a typical pattern of behavior which is being passed on from one generation to another. It may not be illegal in a strict sense. It's just a violation of the way that this community does things. And each community has a kind of set of these unwritten guidelines. So those probably existed in Israel as well. People have spent an awful lot of ink trying to look at the formal laws to figure out just what those guidelines were, what principles of justice and right and community exist under the existing law. And we'll take a look at that in the next lecture. But what I want to do today is to talk about what has occupied the attention of scholars with the Sinai material. And there are two things that we want to talk about. Both of them are terribly important, and neither of them can we exhaust in this lecture. The first is the problem of form. What does the legal section look like, and what do individual laws look like? And for most of the 20th century, there has been an active discussion among scholars into exactly what form these laws take. So that is one thing. The second thing is that it is very clear that our text puts these laws within the context of a covenant. And so for Israel, covenant and law are two things that are bound together. But there has been a very active discussion in scholarly circles about just what the connection is between these two. The argument about legal form in the modern period probably goes back to the work of a German writing in 1934 in German, a German named Albrecht Alt, who was the teacher of Martin Noth. And he writes an important essay, later translated into English, called The Origins of Israelite Law. And in it, he makes two observations about the form of the law, and from there tries, in good form critical style, to talk about the background of these two separate forms. The first one he called casuistic law, which simply means case law. And it has a distinctive form. It is in the if-then pattern. If such and such happens, then this is how you deal with it. And so it grew, according to Alt, from what we would call, in the history of law, case law. That is, it is built up by the collection of legal cases. And to this day, a good portion of our law has to do with case law. It is, if you listen to Supreme Court debates, you will hear, those are the ones that are most common, but sitting in any kind of a court and listening to a legal argument will expose you to both types. There is law, which is stated, and then there is case law. That is, how has the court interpreted these laws? How has the law been modified in order to deal with different circumstances? That is the case. And it will be the collection of precedent, that is the collection of these cases, that itself then becomes a body of law that will guide future generations. So the case law, according to Alt, is quite common. We have it in the ancient Near East, and he's referring mostly here, when he talks about the ancient Near East, to the famous Hammurabi Code of laws, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1800 BC, with the king, the old Babylonian king Hammurabi, who puts these things on a stele and dedicates the stele to the sun god, and probably he is giving the sun god an example of the kind of justice that took place in his land. And the code should probably be translated almost in a kind of narrative form. When so-and-so happened, this is what I did about it. And he's passing it on to the sun god, who is the god of justice in many cultures, because the sun is in a position to see everything that goes on in the world, and therefore is a good deity to be in charge of your judicial system, because they know exactly what is going on at any given time. And in some cultures, and we have hints of this in Ecclesiastes, when the sun sets at the end of the day in the west, how does it then rise in the east? Well, it must go underground. So the sun is in a position of knowing what goes on in the underworld, in addition to what is going on the upper world. And then it rises again on the circuit in the east after setting in the west. And that's the explanation for why the sun moves. So the Hammurabi Code begins with a perfectly good casuistic law in this form that Alt said is an old Near Eastern form. A Hammurabi Code begins with a case that is very explicit. The terms used, as in all law, are quite explicit terms. They're not wanting to have any wishy-washy laws that are open to too much discussion. And so the Hammurabi Code begins with the law when a person of the Awelu class, that is the free citizen class, accuses another member of the Awelu class of a capital crime, that is one which might, if proven true, might lead to a death sentence. So when a person of the Awelu class accuses another person of the Awelu class of capital crime and subsequently does not prove it, the accuser shall be put to death, which is their way of saying no false accusations in court. So Hammurabi wants to open by saying, we took a serious view of lying in a court setting in my reign, and so on. So that's casuistic law. In the Bible, it begins immediately after the Decalogue. Verse 21 is a good example. These are the ordinances that you shall set before them. And now we get our first case. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go out a free person without debt. And now we look at the subcases of the law. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife will go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out a free person, then his master shall bring him before God, that is, to the sanctuary. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him for life. And it moves on from there to deal with the female slaves and so on. So it is a collection of these cases that all seem to be organized and using this kind of if-then pattern. This apparently is what would have gone on in a legal trial, which we know probably took place either in a public space, typically in the gate of a city, which is the only broad space in the town, the only place where people could gather. So it is the elders of the community that would have adjudicated these cases as they are brought by the inhabitants of a town. The idea of appeal to the king as a court of last resort is introduced in the monarchical stories, but Deuteronomy does not provide for that. Deuteronomy has a different take on how the judicial system operates. But probably this kind of law grows out of this business of making accusations. We have a good case in Jeremiah 26, where Jeremiah is accused of saying things as a prophet that are illegal. He speaks against the country, or the temple rather, and the king, and that, according to the accusers, is illegal. And so there is a description there of a trial, and you get a sense of what this kind of trial was like, with various interested parties coming and arguing one way or another way. So Alt thought this kind of law was something that Israel shared with its neighbors, and indeed there are a number of famous parallels between the Hammurabi Code and the code that we have here, mostly in Exodus, the so-called Covenant Code, which we think of as the earliest of the codes in Exodus. But there was a second kind of law Alt said, that is apodictic law. This is law in the imperative. Do this, but do not do that. It is unconditional. That is, it's absolute. Usually in the second person. And originally he thought negative. That is, a prohibition rather than a positive statement. If you look at chapter 23, you have an example of it at the beginning of the chapter. You shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with the wicked to act as a malicious witness. You shall not follow a majority in wrongdoing, and so on. So he thought that this was peculiarly Israelite, this kind of formulation, and that it came from some sort of cultic setting. A characteristic of this kind of law is that unlike casuistic law, where the punishment is stated, in apodictic law, according to Alt, the punishment is often not specified. These are absolute prohibitions or commands, and there is no room for exceptions in there. He also suggested that all of this material that surrounds apodictic law comes from a covenant ceremony of some sort. And also, in other words, he was one of the first, although the idea itself goes back to Weber in the Western tradition. Max Weber, the sociologist, who made the same suggestion, that the covenant is the context in which this law was given. This links law with covenant. Covenant in Hebrew is usually berit, and it probably comes or is related from or is related to the Akkadian word birtu, which means a bond or a fetter, something which binds. And therefore the notion of a covenant, which grows ultimately, we know now, out of international diplomacy. These are international agreements that were made between nation states. And if you're talking about agreements among individuals, there are different words for talking about that. He suggested then that there was an intimate relationship between covenant and law. Now, the advantage of this for non-Jews is that it has allowed the scholarly discussion to focus more on covenant than it has on law. And that's a dreadful mistake. The two are clearly related to each other, and one does not replace the other. Nevertheless, George Mendenhall, whose articles on this you have in your reading, wrote two important articles, one on ancient Oriental and biblical law, and other on the covenant forms in Israelite tradition. He argued that there was an intimate relationship between all law and covenant, and the covenant then became the foundation of all religious obligations, of which law was the primary statement. In the scholarly discussion, the debate now shifted, once Mendenhall wrote, from stressing law to stressing covenant, which allows for a covenant theology, as I've said, without dealing with biblical law. Obligation is part of this. Since Christians have a new covenant, though, you could take this and run in another direction with it. They will have a new law as well. The problem with that is that Christians have been reluctant to let go of some parts of the law, mostly the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are still in, and then the question is what else in the law is still in. So we won't get into that argument. That takes us too far afield. Mendenhall made his case by appealing to what are known as the Hittite treaties, the Hittite vassal treaties, which come from the beginning of the second millennium BC. So they are quite early. They all have a set pattern. They begin with the introduction of the king. Thus says so-and-so, the great king, the king of Hatti land, and so on. Then it goes into a historical prologue, which talks about the relationships between the king and the person with whom the treaty is being made. And then it talks about, in the third part, the stipulations, what the vassal is to do. Usually there are to be no other alliances with other kings. They must trust the king. They have to appear regularly, usually once a year, with a payment or tribute or gift to the king, and so on. 4, there is a provision for the deposit of the document in the temple. 5, there is a list of the gods of both parties to the covenant who are serving as witnesses to the treaty. And if that doesn't work well enough, there are blessings and curses invoked at the very end of the treaty, which are going to come into effect automatically if one party or the other violates the terms of the treaty. Now, Alt has been terribly influential in the way people think about law, but he was wrong about a couple of things. The first one is his notion of the origin of the apodictic law. The law of command, whether positive or negative, is a common cultural feature in all societies. And that was pointed out by another German who wrote on Alt, Erhard Gerstenberger, who talked about the origins of the apodictic law. And in it, he said it came out of a kind of tribal ethos. I think it would be more accurate probably to say that it came out of a kind of family situation. Apodictic law is as common as a parent saying to a child, "Don't touch that, it's hot." That's an apodictic law. And it's too common to really consider it to be a form of law. It really doesn't have enough distinctive features that it would work that way. On the question of covenant, the suggestion of Alt, which he made only in passing, and possibly under the influence of Max Weber, he made it only in passing and did not really develop it. And there is a sense in which Mendenhall sort of got us off on the wrong foot when he started with this by comparing the Hittite treaties. The nearer lying treaties that we now know are the Assyrian vassal treaties of the first millennium. Those are the ones where the Assyrians had a major impact on Israel in the first millennium, and those treaties have a somewhat different form. The Akkadian treaties have a different style. The early treaties from Ebla, which are third millennium, have a different style still. And the forms of the Akkadian treaties are not as fixed as the Hittite treaties that Mendenhall used to make his case. Many of them have to do, in fact, in the Assyrian vassal treaties, have to do with the guarantee of succession. They are quite explicitly succession treaties to get the next ruler of Assyria to be accepted as ruler by the people with whom the parent had the treaty relationship. So a lot of them have that concern. And the form is nowhere near as set as Mendenhall makes it out to be. Nevertheless, the idea of the treaty as an international organizational principle is important and does seem to permeate thinking in the Bible, particularly in Deuteronomy, where the notion of treaty is quite present and clear. But we have moved along a bit since the days of Mendenhall. What I want to do now, in the quick time that remains, is first to march you through the most famous example of an apodictic law, namely the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. We ought to think some about those. They do open the code here, and they are viewed as fundamental also in Deuteronomy, so they are terribly important. And so I want to take a quick run through the Decalogue. There's some things to notice about them, about the commands of the Decalogue. First of all, they are all in the second person singular, not plural, which means that, dear reader, it is you that Moses is, or God, is addressing directly in these commands. These are not seen as general principles for the community. They are specifically for you, and that is the rationale for giving them in the singular. They are part of a series of laws, though there is no indication that this is meant to be an introduction to the general collection, or that it somehow summarizes the general collection. But they do have a special status, and the special status is indicated by the fact that they come directly from the deity. The second thing to notice is that there are no sanctions given here. That is, there is no punishment specified for the violation of these laws. The rabbis, immediately being practically oriented, said, well, we've got to figure out something. I mean, you can't have punishments for these case laws and not have punishment of some sort for violating one of these 10 commandments, which open the corpus. So they decided that all of these violation would receive the death penalty. And that idea came over into Western law. You still see some of these things. If you go back far enough in the common law, you will see the death penalty attaching to these. The trend in recent years, of course, is to have fewer and fewer capital cases, and I'll say more about that when I talk about the spirit of the law and how they dealt with cases of murder, and we'll get into that momentarily. Second, there is no distinction in the Decalogue between the cultic law and the ethical law. That is, crimes against the deity are at the same level as crimes against the community. So they don't make a distinction, which Christians are particularly fond of, namely sort of weeding out those things that have to do with cultic law and keeping only what they consider to be ethical concerns. The Jewish codes generally do not make that distinction at all. And so we need to keep that in mind, and certainly the Decalogue itself does not. The first commandments deal, in fact, with crimes against the deity. The second half of the set deals with crimes against the community, and they are all to be considered of equal weight. So in one sense, because you have a covenant with the deity, a crime against the community is also a crime against the deity, and vice versa. So that needs to be kept in mind. They are also starkly objective. They don't allow for consideration of intent or intention. And that has carried over, incidentally, into Western law as well. It doesn't matter if you violate the law, saying that you did not intend to violate it is not a defense. Courts take a dim view of that. Juries may be swayed by it, but in legal terms, it is not a defense against violation. And the same way here. And finally, notice that they are not part of a class system. That is to say, when I quoted you the Hammurabi Code, I mentioned a technical term, the free citizen. The first law has to do with the free citizen. There would also be laws having to do with the Mushkenu class, which is the crown-dependent class, and that is people who are wards of the state and depend on the king. And in some cases, violations against a Mushkenu is more severely punished than against a crime against a free person, because it touches the throne. It is a violation of a law having to do with the monarch, and it is the monarch who is responsible for these people. We'll come back to that in Deuteronomy, which has a very different way of thinking about that. And then finally, the slave class in the Hammurabi Code. There would be a different law for slaves. This code eventually will have laws that do deal with different classes, but not here. So we're going to stop with that generality, but next time I want to begin by marching you through all 10. And the first thing to say about it is that it is hard to count to 10. Different communities count in different ways, but they all agree that there are 10. And that is because the Bible itself refers to this section as the 10 words. So there've got to be 10, and how you divide that to get to 10 is like getting 12 tribes out of the 12-tribe list. All right, so on Wednesday we'll pick up that and go on a bit and talk about the underlying spirit of the Hebrew law.